Hello friends, Paper Historian here. I'm glad to welcome you to my channel, where we don't just flip through dusty medical texts, we taste the bitter draughts of history itself. Tonight, we're diving into the world of old remedies, the ones your ancestors swore by even as they gagged them down. This is not the story of neat white pills and sterile glass bottles. It's the story of powdered skulls stirred into wine, of dung poultices pressed onto wounds, of snakes drowned in jars of liquor and sold as liquid courage. Remedies that smelled foul, tasted worse, and yet emptied purses from Beijing to Paris. Some worked by accident, some killed slowly, most did nothing at all, except remind us how far people will go when fear of death is louder than disgust. So settle in, because tonight we're not just talking about medicine, we're swallowing the past one revolting dose at a time. He steps into a shop that smells of honey, vinegar, and dust and realizes that medicine, for most of history, was not a white coat, but a wooden counter. Shelves rise to the ceiling, lined with glass and earthenware jars whose labels are Latin, Greek, or merely hopeful. Mumia vera, pulv, crani humani, ossepiae sanguis draconis. The apothecary behind the counter smiles as if everything here is ordinary. It was, once. The most disgusting medicines of the past did not think themselves disgusting. They thought themselves necessary, even kind. Begin with the human body, because it was both the patient and the pharmacy. Across centuries and continents, healers used pieces of people as drugs, convinced that what made a body strong in life could make another strong in illness. The practice has a respectable name, iatromathematics in some places, iatrochemistry in others, but the jars say it more plainly: powdered skull, dried flesh, fat, blood. The idea is older than any particular apothecary. Sympathy, like cures like, was the logic that married disgust to hope. He lifts a jar labelled mumia, and the apothecary tells a story he has told too many times, that this powder comes from Egyptian tombs, from bodies embalmed with bitumen, and that the bitumen is what heals. In reality, the traffic that supplied Europe from the High Middle Ages to the 17th century was sloppy. True bitumen, mineral pitch, rarely appeared. Ground-up mummies did. Traders stripped graves, pounded dark flesh to powder, and shipped it in sacks that turned death into commerce. Surgeons recommended mumia for bruises and internal bleeding. Physicians prescribed it as a general restorative. It tasted of earth and salt and theft. Prices varied with fashion and provenance. Genuine Egyptian mummy fetched more than locally prepared substitutes. Criminals hanged in Europe and quartered, their pieces dried in ovens, sold as mumia europaea. Apothecaries charged by the dram. The poor could not afford it, though poor people supplied it with their bodies. Did it work? Sometimes the bitumen that occasionally appeared may have soothed inflammation. Often the opiate syrups mixed with the powder did the real work. More often, it was merely a placebo that stained the tongue and the conscience. The human skull had its own chapter. In Northern Europe, powdered skull, preferably taken from a young man who had died a violent death, was recommended for epilepsy. Moss that grew on skulls in damp churchyards, Usinia, was scraped and dried, then administered to staunch bleeding, on the theory that what grew out of a head would treat the head's disorders and that moss that clung to bone could teach blood to cling to veins. Apothecaries sold vials of grey-green fluff, priced by scarcity as much as by efficacy. Did it help? Tannins in Usnea can constrict tissue. Sometimes bleeding slowed, and the cure was credited. Epilepsy did not budge. Blood had a different logic. Life lives in it. Roman writers joked about gladiator blood drunk by epileptics at the arena. Early modern recipe books whispered that fresh, warm blood, human if one could get it, animal if not, could strengthen the heart. In 17th century German markets, the executioner sometimes served as pharmacist, offering cups of warm blood to buyers who held their noses and imagined vigor flooding in. Price depended on disgust and supply. One could not haggle much with a man whose hands were red. Did it do anything beyond iron's brief lift? Probably not, but the placebo of warmth is a stubborn thing. Urine and feces completed the human pharmacy, a world away from modern sensibility. Roman laundries used urine for its ammonia, whitening togas, while poets sniggered at the smell. Physicians, less amused, collected distilled urine as a hair treatment and tooth whitener. The best, so said a second-century wit, came from Portugal and was imported to Rome, fetching prices that made breath a luxury. Teeth did shine after frequent rinsings. Ammonia is blunt but effective. In China, in the 4th century, a physician named Ji Hong described a treatment for catastrophic diarrhea that he called yellow soup, a suspension of fermented fecal matter from a healthy donor. The volume of disgust is loud. The signal is real. Modern medicine, 2 millennia later, will rediscover fecal microbiota transplant as life-saving therapy for certain infections. In Ji Hong's time, the cost was the courage to swallow and the status of the donor. Like all good cures, it became a gift only the desperate would accept. Animal dung had a parallel career. Egyptian papyri prescribed donkey dung poultices for wounds. Medieval European recipe books recommend goat droppings boiled in milk for sore throats. Early modern surgeons smear pigeon dung on inflamed eyes, trusting the cool paste more than understanding infection. These were cheap medicines, available in any yard, costing only labor and a pharmacist's straight face. Sometimes the moisture and warmth soothed, sometimes the contamination killed. The patient never knew which outcome had been hidden in the handful. He moves to a smaller shelf and finds jars of fat. Human fat, the horror that modern ears cannot hear without flinching, was rendered after executions and sold as salve for aching joints, scar tissue, gout. Under other labels, Axungia hominis, it sat in respectable pharmacies. King's fat fetched the highest price, of course, as if majesty had seeped into the tissue. In practice, any body would do. Dried, melted, bottled. Did it work? Fats can soften skin, trap heat, ease superficial pain. The cure was less disgusting than it looked, more equal to its humble task than its reputation would suggest. He opens a drawer and finds a stack of talismans, printed paper scripts, amulets with characters, pieces of parchment with saints' names. These are medicines too, though no one calls them that without irony. They cost less than powdered king. They manipulated the same human constants, the will to live and the placebo that is belief. Apart from prayer, the cheapest drug in the pharmacy was hope. Travelling farther, to an Ottoman market or a Chinese apothecary, the shelves change labels but not habits. Dried placenta, powdered, and nicknamed zihiqi, is prescribed in Chinese law to stop postpartum bleeding and to revive when faint. The cost is wrapped in modesty and secrecy. Families dry their own and hide it near the stove, a domestic mumia without the tomb robbing. In Islamic medicine, human milk is recommended for eye ailments. At a bazaar, a donkey milk seller insists his medicine works better. Everywhere people put into their bodies what their bodies once produced, trusting the circle more than the line. Disgust was as stratified as class. The poor endured the grosser remedies because they were cheap or available, not because they loved them. The rich paid for nicer-smelling versions, cardamom mixed into their mumia, ambergris stirred into their tooth powders. They could afford contradiction. A noble in 17th century Paris who swears he would never touch mummy powder has already swallowed beaver castor in his cordial and civet musk in his perfume. He does not find those disgusting because their prices spared his nose as surely as their names spared his imagination. Did these human-derived remedies help? Sometimes by accident, sometimes by ritual, often not at all. Placebo is a Latin word, but a universal fact. Pain recedes when belief is fed, nausea eases when a patient feels they have done the necessary, and belief is cheaper to stock than chemistry. Apothecaries, some sincere, some cynical, sold the past to the fearful and watched their jars grow lighter by degrees. He turns to leave and notices at the door a bowl of herbs set by a paper image. The apothecary murmurs to the kitchen god as he lights a stick of incense. It is another kind of medicine, no more and no less disgusting than the jars of powdered bone. It smells better. The day will bring patients with crooked backs and winter coughs, with babies losing weight and elders losing sleep. The apothecary will offer what he has: jars of ground ancestors, cups of warm urine disguised by the name aqua, rattles of dried toads sewn into leather, perhaps something really helpful. Opium dissolved in syrup, soothing whatever hurts by dulling the brain. He will set his prices higher for the unlikely and his face smoother for the unbelievable. In time, new shelves will replace old. Chemistry will shove skull moss off the counter. Laboratory powders will evict mummy powder from jars. But for now, the past stands with its stare of sooty gods and its rows of unacceptable helps, and the man who came to buy leaves with a packet that his wife will administer carefully, her nose pinched, her prayer focused, because disgust is a small price beside fear. And when the remedy works, the bruise fading, the bleeding stanched, the sleep arriving, the household will credit the jars instead of chance. When it fails, they will blame the batch, the apothecary, the heavens, rarely the idea that disgust and cure were mismatched to begin with. History moves one jar at a time off such shelves. He opens another chapter of the pharmacy's catalogue and finds not the human body, but the animal kingdom pressed into service. Here, the remedies are no less revolting, though sometimes their origins are easier to confess. A goat's gallbladder, a toad dried stiff in the sun, a beaver's gland. These are the materials of cures that shaped centuries. Disgust was not only tolerated, it was trusted. If something was foul, it must be potent. Start with bile. Ancient Greek physicians wrote confidently that animal bile contained purgative powers. In the Middle Ages, apothecaries bottled ox bile, goat bile, even the gall of a rooster. It was prescribed for eye ailments, painted directly onto the cornea to clear vision. Patients wept from burning pain, but doctors interpreted the tears as proof of the cure's work. In China, bear bile was valued for liver complaints, harvested by killing or later by bleeding caged bears. It was bitter enough to convince patients of its strength, and its rarity made it expensive, more than many families could pay. Ironically, bile contains ursodeoxycholic acid, which does have effects on gallstones and digestion. Buried under disgust was a trace of truth. Toads croaked their way into medicine across Eurasia. In Europe, they were dried, powdered, and carried in pouches to ward off plague. A live toad was sometimes strapped to a tumour or abscess, the healer insisting it would draw out poison. As the toad sickened or died, the patient was told the illness had been absorbed. Apothecaries sold dried toads for sums the poor could not afford. Those with less money improvised by catching their own. Did it work? Sometimes the tumour broke on its own, and the toad received credit. Sometimes the patient died, and the family cursed both the toad and the man who prescribed it. Beaver glands, castoreum, had a long and malodorous career. Extracted from sacs near the animal's tail, it stank of musk and resin. Physicians swore by it as a treatment for hysteria, headaches, and seizures. A whiff of castoreum was thought to rouse a fainting patient, its stench shocking them back to consciousness. Women were told to carry small packets during childbirth. Traders valued castoreum as highly as spices. It could cost more than cinnamon. Apothecaries mixed it into draughts with honey to disguise the flavour. Did it help? Perhaps only insofar as a nauseating smell can wake a swooning body. Rodents, insects, reptiles, none escaped. Mice were baked into bread for children's bedwetting, their roasted bodies ground to powder. Earthworms were mashed into poultices for wounds, their slimy bodies interpreted as healing because of their ability to regenerate when cut. Scorpions were steeped in wine, drunk to counteract their own stings. Snakes were dried and powdered for vitality. Cobra flesh in India, viper broth in Europe. Apothecaries priced them by danger. The more feared the animal, the higher the cost of its corpse. Fish brought their share. Dried seahorses, sold in Chinese apothecaries, promised virility. Shark cartilage was hawked in markets as cure for cancer centuries before modern quacks revived the same claim. Whale ambergris, vomited up in the sea and reeking when fresh, was dried and turned into both perfume and medicine. The price of ambergris was astronomical. Only nobles could afford it, and they believed it cured headaches, fainting fits, and melancholy. Honey and excrement often shared recipes. A poultice of cow dung mixed with honey was rubbed onto wounds in medieval Europe. The sweetness meant to draw out infection, the dung to heat the body. Cat dung, when dried and powdered, was given for nosebleeds. Camel dung found its way into Arabian remedies, donkey dung into Egyptian ones. Apothecaries charged little for these because supply was endless. Patients paid with courage, not coin. Even more grotesque was the use of parasites themselves. Tapeworms were deliberately swallowed in the 19th century as living medicine for obesity. Apothecaries sold cysts in vials for the wealthy who sought to slim their waistlines, never mind the sickness that followed. Fleas were bottled and sold as counter-irritants to be released onto the skin to distract from other pains. Cost followed scarcity and risk. Common dung was cheap, dried toads cost more, ambergris could equal a year's wages. Effectiveness followed no such logic. Some substances hid real pharmacological value, bear bile, honey, even earthworms with their antibacterial slime. Others were pure theatre, feeding on desperation. The patient never knew which category they had purchased until too late. The logic was consistent. The more disgusting, the more convincing. If it made you gag, it must also make illness flee. Healers repeated the refrain, apothecaries stocked their shelves, and patients forced down brews that modern noses can scarcely imagine. Behind every foul potion lay fear. Fear of plague, fear of pain, fear of death. And fear is the most expensive ingredient of all. He moves from shelves that stink of animals to jars that glitter with stone and metal. Here, the physician's imagination collides with alchemy, and the result is as dangerous as it is absurd. For centuries, healers believed that the earth's minerals carried hidden powers, and if one could swallow them in the right form, sickness would be banished. In practice, patients were poisoned in slow motion, and yet they paid dearly for the privilege. Mercury leads the procession. In China, Taoist alchemists believed cinnabar, the red ore of Mercury, held the secret of immortality. Ground, heated, and ingested, it was said to prolong life, restore youth, even make one divine. Emperors swallowed pellets of cinnabar mixed with honey and died foaming at the mouth, but the belief persisted for centuries. Apothecaries charged fortunes for these vermilion pills, each one shimmering like a promise. In Europe, mercury took another form, quicksilver rubbed on syphilitic sores or swallowed in draughts. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, went the bitter joke. Patients endured salivation, tooth loss, tremors, but sometimes their lesions healed, and they believed the poison was cure. Antimony was another favourite. Physicians praised it as a purifier. Pills of antimony were swallowed to provoke vomiting and then, most grotesque, recovered from excrement, washed and reused. Families passed down these everlasting pills as heirlooms, as if immortality resided in their shiny grey surface. Did it work? Certainly. It purged violently, leaving patients weak but convinced that sickness had been expelled. Apothecaries priced antimony according to weight. A single pill could cost what a labourer earned in weeks. Lead, with its sweet taste, appeared in syrups and wine additives. Romans already laced wine with sarpa, grapemus boiled in lead pots, unaware that headaches and madness followed. In later centuries, physicians prescribed lead-based plasters for wounds, even powders for skin lightening. Women of fashion paid heavily for cosmetics that slowly destroyed their skin and organs. In pharmacies, sugar of lead sat in respectable jars. It was cheap enough for the middle class, disastrous enough for all. Arsenic, the king of poisons, was paradoxically sold as cure. In small doses, it was believed to stimulate appetite and improve complexion. Apothecaries in the 19th century sold Fowler's solution, arsenic in water, for everything from asthma to psoriasis. Earlier, powdered arsenic was sprinkled on ulcers, drunk in wine mixed with honey. Costs varied, but its reputation as both medicine and poison kept it in constant demand. Patients brightened for a while, skin glowing, before the inevitable wasting set in. They mistook the poison's first flush for health. Sulphur, brimstone itself, was taken with more optimism. Burned in fumigations, it was thought to drive out demons and plague alike. In powdered form, it was eaten for skin diseases, drunk for digestive woes. Its stench of rotten eggs convinced many that evil was fleeing the body. It was cheap, available from volcanic regions, and thus a staple in both rich and poor households. Sometimes it did help. Sulphur ointments remained useful for parasites and scabies, but dosage was crude, and overdoses scorched throats as easily as infections. Copper salts had their place too. Verdigris, scraped from weathered bronze, was used for eye infections, smeared into wounds, even swallowed for internal cleansing. It burned viciously, left green stains on skin and cloth, but doctors swore by it. Patients with no coins sometimes scraped copper pots themselves, inventing home remedies that blinded as often as they healed. Gold entered the apothecary under the banner of nobility. Alchemists promised elixirs made with dissolved gold could cure melancholy and prolong life. Nobles paid enormous sums for aurum potabile, drinkable gold, believing its radiance would illuminate their own bodies. In truth, most preparations contained little actual gold and much honey, wine, or herbs. Still, the expense ensured faith. A draft could cost as much as a farmer's annual harvest. Faith and coin together made the medicine seem powerful, even when it was nothing but glitter in a cup. The logic was consistent. If a metal was precious, its essence must be potent. If a mineral was pungent or dangerous, it must have force enough to fight disease. Patients tolerated retching, diarrhea, trembling, blindness, even death, because the alternative, untreated illness, seemed worse. Healers recorded successes and ignored failures. Apothecaries priced accordingly, mercury and gold at the top, sulphur and copper at the bottom, with arsenic, antimony and lead scattered in between. Did these mineral medicines help? Occasionally. Sulphur salves soothed parasites, mercury sometimes suppressed syphilis, copper occasionally killed bacteria in wounds. But more often, they poisoned slowly, writing tragedy into bones and nerves. The disgust they provoked was less about taste than about suffering, the constant drooling of mercury patients, the green vomit of copper drinkers, the blackened gums of lead users. Families endured it because hope was louder than horror. The shelves of the old pharmacy gleamed with powders and salts, deadly masquerading as divine. Each jar represented a faith in the earth's hidden powers, a willingness to risk life for cure. And each coin laid on the counter was a reminder that despair always pays well. The apothecary's shelves bend now under roots, seeds, and herbs, some familiar as kitchen spices, others shaped like nightmares. Plants promised cures as often as they delivered poison, and the line between medicine and horror was thin. If it grew with a strange shape, smelled acrid, or burned the tongue, someone would swear it contained power. Mandrake led the parade of grotesque botanicals. Its forked root resembled a human body, and legend insisted it screamed when pulled from the ground, killing anyone who heard it. Harvesting rituals required tying the plant to a dog and letting the animal yank it free, so the dog, not the human, would die from the cry. Apothecaries sold mandrake dried, powdered, or steeped in wine as a sedative and fertility aid. Prices soared because of its rarity and drama. Nobles paid dearly for roots shaped most like humans. Did it work? In small doses, mandrake contains hallucinogens that can dull pain. In larger doses, it simply killed. Opiates lurked in jars too. Poppy latex, scraped and dried, was blended into syrups to calm crying children, soothe coughs, and quiet pain. Laudanum, opium dissolved in wine, became a universal draught in Europe. It dulled agony but bred addiction. Apothecaries charged by the dropper, and wealthy households kept bottles like treasures. The poor relied on cheaper concoctions, sometimes adulterated with soot or bile. Relief was real, but so was dependence, and families paid in both coin and health. Tobacco, first a novelty from the New World, quickly earned a reputation as medicine. Physicians recommended smoking to cleanse lungs, snuff to clear the head, even tobacco juice to rid the body of worms. Patients choked, spat, and gagged, interpreting discomfort as cure. The weed's rarity made it expensive in the 16th century. Nobles paid small fortunes for a pouch. By the time it spread widely, it was cheap enough for peasants, and its reputation as medicine slowly gave way to habit. Spices filled prescriptions too, not only for flavor, but for their exotic aura. Cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, cardamom, all carried astronomical prices thanks to distant trade routes. They were stirred into tonics for fever, rubbed onto gums for toothache, steeped in broths for colds. Patients equated expense with efficacy. A draught spiced with cinnamon cost more than a laborer's daily wage. Did it help? Sometimes. Clove oil can numb pain. Cinnamon has antimicrobial properties. But more often, the spice served only as perfume for other, fouler ingredients. Other herbs were darker still. Henbane and belladonna, plants heavy with tropane alkaloids, were mixed into ointments for pain or hallucination. Women accused of witchcraft were said to use them in flying ointments smeared on skin to provoke visions. Physicians prescribed them for sleeplessness or neural disorders. Doses were nearly impossible to measure. Too little did nothing, too much paralyzed or killed. They were cheap to gather, costly in effect. Rhubarb, imported from China along Silk Road caravans, was prized as a purgative. Its bitter stalks were powdered and sold at prices equal to silver. European physicians swore by it for constipation and fevers. Families sold livestock to afford a few ounces. Ginger, ginseng, and other roots shared similar reputations. The rarer the plant, the higher the price, and the more miraculous the claims. Even poisons were drafted into service. Hemlock, infamous for killing Socrates, was prescribed in tiny doses for arthritis. Foxglove leaves, long before modern chemistry discovered digitalis, were chewed for dropsy. The line between remedy and lethal misstep was narrow. Apothecaries charged little. Nature provided these freely, but patients often paid with their lives. In ritual, plants carried theatre. Mandrake screamed, henbane induced visions, opium made the world distant, tobacco made the head spin. The more dramatic the effect, the more convincing the cure. Disgust came in taste and sensation. The bitterness of wormwood tea for stomach pain, the burn of mustard plasters on skin for fevers, the stench of asafoetida de gum, nicknamed devil's dung, prescribed for hysteria and digestive woes. Cheap, foul-smelling and foul-tasting asafoetida was called miracle by some, torment by others. Costs varied wildly. Peasants could gather henbane, foxglove, or mustard freely. Mandrake, opium, rhubarb, and ginseng belonged to elites. A single mandrake root might cost more than a year's taxes. A vial of laudanum more than a month's grain. Spices were luxury medicine, cinnamon for nobles, garlic for peasants. Both were believed to cure colds. One was fragrant, the other pungent. Both offended noses, but only one emptied purses. Did any of these work? Sometimes, astonishingly. Foxglove truly strengthens weak hearts. Opium truly kills pain. Cloves truly numb. But measurement was guesswork, and toxicity was constant. Patients took too much, too little, or simply the wrong plant. Death often masqueraded as cure, and recovery was often credited to whatever foul potion had been tried last. The apothecary knew this, yet his shelves remained full. Plants were plentiful, and desperation inexhaustible. Every bitter brew poured down a throat carried equal parts hope and horror. And every coin dropped on the counter proved that people would endure any taste, any smell, any disgust, if only it came with the promise, however false, of relief. He pauses now at the stranger drawers of the apothecary, where the line between pharmacy and folklore blurs completely. Here, disgust grows almost comic. Rocks ground to dust, creatures mixed with wine, slime stirred with honey, all offered in solemn tones as salvation. These are the medicines that make later centuries shudder, yet in their own time they were recited as confidently as any physician's oath. Stones came first. Alchemists loved them. Gems were thought to carry the essence of heaven. Pulverized emerald was prescribed for poisoning, powdered sapphire for eye disease, ground pearls for weakness of the heart. In China, pearl powder was stirred into tonics for complexion and longevity, fetching prices that only nobility could afford. Women swallowed pearls worth a farmer's year of harvest just to keep their skin pale. Did it work? Calcium carbonate has no magic for skin. What really worked was poverty staying outdoors and nobility staying inside. Yet the pearl medicine persisted because its expense made its failure invisible. Coral, red as blood, was powdered and drunk for hemorrhage. Lapis lazuli, the stone prized by painters, was swallowed in Europe for melancholy, in Persia for fevers. Each grain scraped a purse, thin. Even plain clay was used. Armenian bole, a reddish earth, sold across Europe as a cure for plague. Families bought it in desperation, mixed it into wine, gagged it down, and prayed. Some clays absorbed toxins, most simply sat in the stomach, like stones offering reassurance without rescue. Next to stones was stranger brews, animal parts soaked in alcohol. Wine was the universal solvent of pre-modern medicine, and into it went every imaginable horror. Snake wine, still infamous, was prepared by drowning venomous serpents in jars of rice wine. The logic, venom transformed into vigor. In China and Vietnam, jars with coiled cobras were sold as cure for rheumatism and virility. The more fearsome the snake, the higher the price. Did it work? Alcohol dulled pain, the story stiffened spines, and placebo did the rest. Scorpion wine followed the same pattern. Arachnids dropped into jars, their bitterness steeped into liquid. Tarantulas, beetles, even centipedes found their way into regional remedies. People drank them with pinched noses, convinced that swallowing poison in ritual form armed the body against real disease. Disgust was the proof of potency. Europe had its own animal wines. Viper broth was fashionable in the Renaissance, snakes boiled with herbs and drunk by nobles seeking strength. Some physicians swore by it for skin diseases, others for fevers. Apothecaries charged by the serpent, the rarer the better. Goose fat was infused into wine for coughs, toad dried and steeped for plague. Recipes blurred into magic. A black rooster killed at dawn, its blood mixed with wine, drunk as prophylactic against pestilence. Each step was costly, but families paid when death knocked at the village gate. Honey was another universal mixer, its sweetness masking horrors. In Greece and Rome, honey was blended with ashes of crabs, horns of deer, even dung of dogs to make pastes for wounds. In medieval Europe, honey mixed with crushed snails was daubed on ulcers. Honey with dried worms swallowed for fevers. Honey was cheap enough, but the additives gave it price and prestige. Patients gagged and swallowed, trusting sweetness to tame disgust. More grotesque were hybrid recipes of human and animal remains. In German folk medicine, fat from executed criminals was rendered, mixed with herbs, and spread on wounds as balm. In England, a salve called oil of man included human fat and rose oil applied to joints. Some healers prescribed drinking broth brewed from dried human bones and deer antlers together, an unnatural communion of species meant to double strength. Apothecaries charged steeply, partly for supply, partly for secrecy. These cures existed in whispers, yet customers appeared because desperation grows louder than shame. Regional folk remedies multiplied endlessly. In Scandinavia, dried frog hearts sewn into pouches were worn against seizures. In Russia, bear gall and wolf liver were powdered for courage. In Japan, ground centipedes were taken for sore throats, dried silkworm droppings for fevers. In India, elephant dung was dried and smoked to treat asthma, cow urine drunk as purifier. Each region trusted what was near, and the more revolting the preparation, the more memorable its reputation. Prices varied by geography. Stones and pearls were the highest tier, consumed by nobles with wealth to waste. Snakes, scorpions, and frogs formed a middle tier, expensive if imported, cheap if caught locally. Dung, worms, and snails were cheapest, medicines of peasants. Yet even the poor paid in coin and pride, swallowing what disgusted them because hope cost more than taste. Did these bizarre preparations help? Sometimes, faintly. Honey soothed wounds regardless of what it carried. Alcohol preserved and numbed. Certain venoms in microdoses might have stimulated immunity. But most remedies were empty gestures, dramatized by disgust. People believed because they felt they had paid the price, in money, in shame, in nausea. The cure was the performance of endurance. Imagine a patient choking down pearl powder in Beijing, another sipping viper broth in Florence, another rubbing dung poultice in Cairo. Each grimaces, each hopes, each prays that disgust will balance disease. That faith, not the powder or wine, carried them through. And apothecaries profited, their shelves lined with jars that smelled of salt, bile, and desperation. The history of medicine's most revolting corner shows one truth: people will swallow anything if death is worse. Stones, snakes, dung, or dust. The recipe mattered less than the conviction that survival lay in the bottom of the cup. And for that conviction, there was always a price, counted in coin and in taste. He looks one last time across the shelves, and the jars no longer shock him. After hours of powders, bile, dung, stones, and wine steeped with venom, disgust has become routine. That is the truest legacy of pre-modern medicine. What seems unbearable to later centuries was once ordinary, defended by physicians, praised by apothecaries, endured by patients. The real question is how the world finally walked away from it, or rather, why it took so long. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the first cracks. Experiment replaced inheritance. Alchemists chasing gold stumbled into chemistry. Paracelsus in the 16th century declared, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes the poison." He swallowed mercury, antimony, arsenic, already familiar horrors, but insisted that balance and measure mattered more than sympathy and superstition. His ideas shocked the universities, but apprentices listened. For the first time, the same mercury that poisoned emperors in China or syphilitics in Europe was analyzed, weighed, tested. the logic of dosage crept into medicine, even if its instruments were crude. By the 18th century, anatomy theatres spread. Dissections revealed organs as they really were, not as humans described them. Physicians began to ask why swallowing powdered skull should cure epilepsy if the brain itself was not understood. Some abandoned the old materia medica outright. Others clung to it, but added skepticism. Apothecaries hedged. They sold pearl powder, but also bark from the cinchona tree, newly imported from the Americas, which genuinely broke fevers. The taste of quinine was bitter, but not disgusting, and its effects undeniable. Slowly, bitter began to replace foul. The Industrial Revolution shifted the balance. Factories that refined acids, alkalis, and dyes also produced the first consistent chemical compounds. Morphine was isolated from opium in the early 19th century. Suddenly, instead of forcing laudanum of unknown strength down every throat, physicians could measure pain relief in drops and grains. The same century brought salicylic acid from willow bark, chloroform for surgery, ether for anesthesia. These smelled strange, but no longer relied on superstition or revulsion. Disgust was still present, the gag of chloroform, the sting of ether, but it was functional, not mystical. The marketplace responded. Apothecaries who once thrived on jars of mumia or dung lost ground to pharmacists who could guarantee purity and dosage. Prices changed too. A dram of mummy powder cost dearly because it was exotic and rare. A tablet of aspirin, when it finally arrived in 1899, cost pennies because it could be mass-produced. Patients learned to trust factory seals more than exotic labels. Faith migrated from folklore to industry. Still, revolting remedies did not vanish overnight. Rural Europe in the 19th century still applied cow dung poultices to wounds, convinced warmth mattered more than sterility. In China, bear bile remained part of traditional apothecaries, even as Western drugs appeared. In India, cow urine was drunk as purifier well into modern times, and still is by some. The persistence of disgust was cultural inertia. Practices endured because they carried memory, ritual, and the authority of elders. Science was young, tradition was ancient. Modern germ theory was the real guillotine. Pasteur and Koch proved that microbes, not miasmas, carried disease. Suddenly, cleanliness mattered more than concoction. To smear dung on a wound was not to draw out poison, but to insert infection. To drink blood was not to strengthen the heart, but to invite pathogens. Physicians who once prescribed revolting cures began to preach soap, boiling water, sterilization. These remedies were less theatrical, less exotic, but infinitely more effective. Patients still balked. How can plain water cure what once required a pearl? But statistics silenced doubt. Hospitals that sterilized instruments lost fewer patients. Armies that boiled water lost fewer soldiers. The 19th century also birthed skepticism in a broader sense. Public health boards, newspapers, and reformers ridiculed apothecaries who sold powders of bone or dung. Satirists drew cartoons of physicians feeding patients frogs or snakes. Quack medicine still flourished, snake oil, patent pills, but the rhetoric shifted. Sellers no longer advertised dung or blood. They promised scientific formulas, even when lying. Disgust became marketing suicide. Respectability required bottles that looked clean, labels that sounded chemical. Yet traces of the old remedies survive in odd corners. Fecal transplant, rediscovered in the 20th and 21st centuries, echoes J. Hong's yellow soup. Digitalis, purified from foxglove, now strengthens hearts under prescription instead of guesswork. Morphine and codeine, once disguised as foul brews, now sit in controlled tablets. Even arsenic lingers in modern oncology in tightly measured doses. The lesson is paradoxical. Inside the revolting was sometimes a kernel of real medicine, hidden under superstition, waiting for measurement. Cost also transformed. Where once a pearl powder emptied a noble's purse, now antibiotics in pill form cost less than a loaf of bread. Where once dung poultices were cheap but dangerous, now vaccines are expensive to develop, but cheap to distribute at scale. Hope no longer required swallowing foulness. It required trust in invisible laboratories. The shift was less from disgust to delight than from sensory proof to institutional proof. Patients no longer needed to gag to believe. They needed to see a doctor's diploma, a pharmacy's license, a government seal. But belief in revolting remedies never dies completely. Folk medicine continues everywhere. Families in rural villages still boil herbs mixed with animal parts. Internet forums in the 21st century advertise detox drinks as vile-tasting proof of their power. Weight loss scams revive the old tapeworm diet in whispers. Bare bile farms persist despite synthetic alternatives. Disgust remains persuasive. If something tastes awful, it must be working. That is the old logic echoing in modern throats. The history of disgusting medicine is, in truth, the history of desperation. Patients endured frog poultices and dung ointments because the alternative was pain and death. Apothecaries sold mummy powder and pearl dust because people would buy anything that promised to cheat the grave. Prices climbed with scarcity, fell with fashion, and always tracked fear more than efficacy. What mattered was not whether a cure worked, but whether it felt strong enough to match the terror of disease. Looking back, it is easy to sneer at the past, to imagine ourselves above powdered skulls or urine rinses. But disgust is a slippery thing. Modern medicine still uses leeches, maggots, fecal transplants, remedies that would have made 18th century patients nod knowingly. The difference is that today we can explain why. Our disgust is tempered by evidence. Theirs was harnessed as evidence itself. The shelves of the apothecary, now covered in dust in museums, remind us that healing has always been theatre as much as science. Honey and dung, pearls and poisons, snakes and stones, all were props in humanity's endless play against mortality. The actors were physicians, patients, and apothecaries. The audience was fear, and the ticket was always expensive. Now, when you swallow a clean white tablet with a glass of sterile water, remember that your ancestors once drank scorpion wine and called it salvation. Remember that disgust is not gone, only domesticated. And remember that every cure begins not with chemistry, but with belief. The same belief that once made frog hearts precious and dung poultices endurable. Medicine has changed. Humanity's hunger to be healed has not. One thing medicine cannot save you from are fleas, mites, bedbugs, and the like. Our next story will concern all of the above and more, so settle in and listen along. He hears the bite before he names it. A tiny itch that blooms into a need, a finger drifting toward the scalp or the ankle without permission. In any pre-modern room, the cottage with rushes on the floor, the city bedchamber curtained in wool, the soldier's tent, this choreography repeats itself 100 times a day. Lice and fleas are not intruders here. They are part of the furniture, so common that no one wastes hatred on them for long. Hatred doesn't pull a nit from a hair. Habit does. Across centuries, long before glass bottles promised miracles, people fought the itch with tools, heat, smoke, vinegar, shaving, and the oldest medicine of all, each other's hands. The daily campaign begins at dawn. He sits by the doorway where light is best and draws a comb through his hair. Bone or boxwood, its teeth so fine that light cannot pass between them. Children line up the way children always have, swapping insults while waiting for their turn. A mother tips a head toward the sun, pinches a pale oval off a hair with the same practiced gentleness she uses to shell peas, and pops it under a thumbnail with a crisp little crack. It is domestic as bread. In medieval streets, the comb comes out again at church porch or well. In Roman atriums, a slave chases knights through a senator's carefully curled beard. In a Tang courtyard, a grandmother's lap becomes a battlefield where lice die and gossip thrives. Monkeys did not invent grooming as affection, humans perfected it. Laundry is the second front. He knows that lice live in seams as much as in hair, so he and his wife beat shirts on river stones until the water runs clouded, then boil them in lye and ash. In winter, when boiling water is dear, garments are hung on a line in frost. Coal can murder eggs nearly as efficiently as heat. In towns with communal ovens, the day after baking becomes delousing day. A bundle of clothes is slid into the cooling mouth to bake whatever still clings to linen. Bed straw is shaken out, the tick opened and filled with new reeds, and for a few nights the itch goes quiet. Then the world climbs back in. Repetition, not revelation, keeps a family from being eaten alive. He reaches for powders when patience and comb teeth fail. Apothecary jars have always held weapons with names both hopeful and dangerous. Stavesacre, delphinium seeds, ground to dust and worked into a paste. Pyrethrum daisies from the Caucasus dried and rubbed into hair. Pennyroyal and wormwood strewn across floors. Asafoetida hung in tiny bags near the skin. In Ming China, rice vinegar is massaged into the scalp before combing. In the Ottoman bath, olive oil is worked through hair to smother hatched lice before the Enayat comb sings its fine-toothed song. None of these are clean kills every time. All of them are better than nothing. The smell of Stavesacre clings to a pillow. Bitter victory. Fire and smoke join the campaign. A cloak hung over juniper branches above embers, and beaten sends fleas to their gods. A brazier trundled under a bed drives bedbugs from seams long enough to crush them. In alpine cottages, sulphur is burned in a pot while windows are shuttered. The cough it raises forgiven for the way it sweeps the room. Householders fling powdered herbs over rushes, not only to perfume air, but to drive pests from feet. The floor becomes both carpet and trap. In Japan, he watches a lacquered hibachi sit under a robe, warmth drawing fleas upward to be plucked. In France, a tiny flea trap, a silver or ivory capsule smeared with honey, hangs from a ribbon at a lady's throat, a theatrical convenience that catches more conversation than vermin, but speaks to constant vigilance. Fleas are jokes in poetry and problems in life. Women keep their fingers near the skin because every skin in the room is a drum fleas play on. Shaving is a blunt answer, and men choose it often. In the 17th century, when wigs become fashion in Europe, he and his peers send their hair to the floor and their heads into caps, not because vanity demands it, but because control does. A shaved scalp can be scrubbed. A wig can be boiled, baked, powdered with insecticidal dusts, and sent back to the head clean. Skulls under perukes itch less than skulls under their own hair. Not always, not for everyone, but for enough men that the fashion feels like hygiene disguised as rank. Later rumour will insist that wigs crawled with lice. Sometimes they did. Powder and pomatum became buffets when barbers were lazy. But more often, the vermin lived where they always had. In the seams of caps, in collars, in the beds of men too exhausted to delouse. Wigs were less a nest than a removable landscape, easier to fumigate than a head, easier to hand to a barber than to hand to a wife. He learns to live with fleas differently from lice. Fleas travel, tiny acrobats moving from dog to trousers to bed within an hour. Floors strewn with herbs, dogs combed at the doorway before they're allowed in, sleeping mats shaken at dusk. These are the rituals that keep their armies to a tolerable size. In valleys where winter bites hard, the freeze grants a kind of truce. In river cities where damp breeds everything, the fight feels endless and the arsenal changes. Camphor balls hung in closed chests, orange peels boiled with soap to wash floors, vinegar in bowls beneath beds to lure and drown, candles passed along mattress seams at night to find and singe the little jumpers. He calls this housekeeping. His grandchildren, reading glossy magazines 4 centuries later, will call it integrated pest management and claim invention. Armies and ships make the problem louder. Body lice, The seam dwellers that carry fever earn the name chats from French soldiers and cooties from Americans much later, but the behavior is identical in every war. Men strip, boil shirts, and spend evenings chatting, cracking lice under thumbnails in long lines of camaraderie and resignation. In galleys and caravels, he watches men sun their clothes on the deck, knits hissing as eggs die in heat. In the trenches of a 20th century front, he sees delousing stations with steam sterilizers and laughs at the distance between a monastery's bath rule and a field commander's hygiene order. The strategy does not change, only the brass. He handles the small tools that made scratching civilized. Court ladies of the Baroque dangle tiny ivory scratchers from chatelaines, their spooned ends made to reach beneath a stiff bodice and find a bite without rucking silk. Gentlemen carry scratchbacks, little hands of silver on telescoping stems, jokes turned necessities when powder and pomade turn scalps into party. In China, he sees bamboo ear spoons, double-ended with a minute scoop and a blunt pick, used to stroke itches and clean ears while conversation ambles. In Edo streets, a peddler sells kamikaki, wooden scalp scratchers carved like cranes, their bills the perfect angle to soothe beneath an elaborate coiffure. These are not weapons, they are acknowledgements. Itch will win sometimes. One gives it an instrument with manners. He knows the cost of itching in coin. Fine combs are cheap, where bone is abundant and expensive, where only metal teeth work well. Juniper branches for fumigation cost only a walk to the hill. Camphor costs trade. Stavesacre and pyrethrum are dear until gardens spread their seeds. A wig sent to a barber for boiling and powdering drains a gentleman's purse on a schedule more regular than church bells. A soldier's delousing day costs only pride. A mother's hour spent hunting nits costs the most valuable currency of all, time not spent on any other survival. Effectiveness is a spectrum, and everyone knows it. Vinegar loosens knights from hair shafts. Oils smother if one is patient. Heat kills, sometimes with the fabric it's meant to save. Smoke drives or asphyxiates depending on luck and lung. Nothing is perfect, and so everything is used in rotation. He decided long ago that the goal is not purity, but tolerable company. The enemy is not the last louse alive, but the swarm that makes sleep impossible. He fights to a draw most days, and calls that victory. When he hears a later century ask archly, "Were wigs full of lice?" he shrugs from across time and answers, "Babe, everything was, often. Wigs were tools to control, not causes of infestation in themselves." The finest delousing device ever invented is the human hand, at leisure and attention. He used it on his children every dawn. Soldiers used it on each other every evening. Lovers used it when words failed and comfort needed a shape. Behind every comb's teeth and every scratcher's spoon is the oldest social contract. I will keep you from being devoured if you will keep me sane. That is how people fought lice and fleas when gold could not buy relief and miracles came with vinegar on their breath. He stands, stretches, and the itch does not return for a heartbeat. That too is a kind of medicine, a momentary grace earned by repetition. Tomorrow's bites will arrive with the dew, the comb will wait by the door, the kettle will boil with lye, the juniper will smoke, the little ivory hand will scratch discreetly under brocade, and family fingers will hunt through hair while stories knit a room into a refuge. In the war between skin and small mouths, disgust is less useful than diligence, and diligence, like a fine-toothed comb, works by narrowing the spaces where trouble can hide. He wakes again to the sound of scratching, because in any pre-modern household, the day begins with the itch. No one pretends that lice and fleas can be banished entirely. They can only be managed, driven back for a week or a day, kept to a level that allows sleep and dignity. This management becomes routine, as much a part of life as cooking porridge or fetching water. Clothing is the first battleground. In every era before synthetic fabrics, people know that vermin loves seams and folds more than bare skin. Shirts and trousers are boiled when fuel is available, beaten on stones when not, and smoked above embers when patience is short. In medieval villages, after bread is baked, families slide their bedding and clothes into the oven's residual heat, turning kitchens into makeshift sterilizers. The smell of scorched straw lingers, but the seams go quiet for a while. In Arctic huts, furs are frozen outside overnight. In tropical villages, mats are laid in the sun until eggs dry to dust. Cold and heat both serve as exterminators when nothing else is at hand. Hair demands its own arsenal. Fine-toothed combs remain universal, carved from bone, wood, ivory, or cast in bronze. They are heirlooms as much as utensils, passed down generations. Children sit in doorways, their mothers parting hair with practiced speed, cracking knits under thumbnails while gossip flows. Roman writers joked that slaves in wealthy households spent more time delousing their masters' scalps than polishing silver. In the Ottoman bathhouse, steam loosens lice from hair and attendants comb through clients as part of the service. In Edo, Japan, street barbers advertise enite picking alongside shaves. The work is slow, undignified, and utterly necessary. Powders and pastes supplement combing. In Europe, the seeds of stavesacre are ground and sprinkled onto scalps, their alkaloids stunning lice into stillness. In the Middle East, pyrethrum daisies are crushed for the same purpose. In India, neem leaves are boiled and rubbed into the hair, their bitterness repelling insects. Vinegar rinses loosen knits from hair shafts. Oils smother them. The remedies are not pleasant. Scalps sting, hair smells acrid, but disgust is tolerated more easily than endless itching. Beds are notorious strongholds. Rushes on floors are sprinkled with aromatic herbs, lavender, wormwood, pennyroyal, not only to perfume, but to repel. Mattresses are refilled with fresh straw, bedding hung in sunlight, seams singed with candles. In France, fashionable households buy flea traps, tiny silver boxes smeared with honey or blood, worn as jewelry, more conversation piece than cure. In China, sticky paper is laid beside beds. In rural Russia, tubs of water are placed under bed legs, forcing fleas to leap into drowning. Everyone invents some trick because sleep is impossible without it. Wigs and elaborate hairpieces create their own mythology. In 17th and 18th century Europe, barbers and wig makers boil and bake perukes to cleanse them. Powdered with flour or starch, wigs look pristine, but they also attract vermin if neglected. Rumour paints every noble head as crawling, yet the truth is mixed. For the wealthy, wigs are easier to delouse than natural hair. They can be handed over, fumigated, powdered with insecticide, and returned clean. For the careless, they become infestations. Satirists seize on the image of crawling wigs because disgust always makes for sharper jokes than hygiene. Scratching itself evolves into an art. The itch must be relieved without breaking dignity, especially in public. Tiny scratches, miniature hands carved of ivory or silver, hang from belts in Europe. In Japan, bamboo scalp scratchers shaped like cranes are sold at markets. Ladies in stiff gowns reach for delicate scratching spoons hidden in sleeves. Children use ear spoons to stroke itches while pretending to clean. Every culture designs tools to turn an awkward spasm into a controlled gesture. It is not cure, but it is survival with manners. Communal settings magnify the problem. Soldiers nickname lice chats or seam strollers and spend evenings chatting, cracking them together by lamplight. Crusaders in the Levant boil tunics over fires, while Mongol horsemen pick fleas from furs at camp. On ships, sailors sun their hammocks on deck, killing nits in the heat. By the 20th century, armies established delousing stations with steam boilers, echoing the old village oven. Technology changes, but the scratching chorus of men at rest remains the same across centuries. Costs remain layered by class. Poor households rely on boiling, freezing, smoke, and fingers. Wealthy ones pay barbers for wig care, buy powders scented with ambergris to mask bitter herbs, or commission scratchers of silver. A comb is cheap enough for everyone, but its material, bone, ivory, tortoiseshell, marks status. Flea traps of gold are luxury jokes. Smoke and vinegar remain universal currencies of relief. Effectiveness is rarely absolute. A week after laundering, the itch returns. After powders, a new brood hatches. After scratching, fresh bites appear. The goal is not victory, but balance, reducing vermin to tolerable numbers. Entire households measure success by how well they sleep, not by whether they are free. And so the daily ritual endures. Comb, crack, boil, smoke, scratch, repeat. Entire lives are lived in the rhythm of itches and remedies. When later centuries ask with disgust, were wigs full of lice? Did nobles crawl with fleas? The answer is both yes and no. Everyone, from beggar to prince, fought the same tiny war. Some fought with combs and vinegar, others with silver scratchers and perfumed powders, but none escaped. The battlefield was the body itself, and the truce lasted only until the next egg hatched. He scratches, and poets notice. Lice and fleas creep not only through seams and wigs, but through songs, sermons, and satire. Culture could not ignore what every skin endured, and so the vermin became characters in jokes, metaphors in sermons, and symbols in paintings. To understand how people once lived with infestation is also to understand how they talked about it, half in laughter, half in shame. In medieval Europe, sermons thundered that lice were the pearls of the poor. Preachers meant both mockery and consolation. Peasants who could not afford jewelry bore jewels of their own, crawling under their collars. It was a cruel joke, but it carried resignation. Pilgrims scratching on the road to Santiago comforted themselves that itching was proof of humility. Monks, forbidden baths too often, treated vermin as both punishment and penance, noting with bitter humour that the cloister's silence was broken more by scratching than by chanting. Literature seized on fleas as symbols of desire. In the 16th century, John Donne wrote a love poem in which a flea that bit both him and his lover became their mingled blood, an argument for intimacy. The grotesque was eroticized. The insect that interrupted sleep became the excuse for seduction. French poets played similar games, mocking noble ladies who powdered wigs but could not stop scratching beneath lace. A flea's leap became a metaphor for quick wit, a louse a metaphor for cowardice. Disgust was turned into wordplay because wordplay is easier to share than shame. Satirists never missed the chance. Caricatures in 18th century London showed dandies with wigs teeming, barbers shaking powder clouds that released swarms. Pamphlets mocked courtiers who spent fortunes on perfumes while their stockings swarmed with fleas. In Paris, playwrights staged comedies where scratching in court became a chorus of embarrassment. The wig as vermin nest entered legend not only because it happened sometimes, but because it made audiences laugh and sniff their own collars nervously. Fables gave vermin moral voices. In Russian folk tales, fleas mocked tsars in rhyme. In Chinese anecdotes, lice reminded scholars that poverty was a stricter tutor than any master. In African proverbs, fleas symbolized persistence. If the flea bites, the lion must scratch. In every culture, the bite became lesson. Some saw divine chastisement, others comic inevitability. Art depicted it obliquely. Dutch genre paintings of barbershops often include night combing in the background, a sign of everyday intimacy. Japanese ukiyo-e prints show mothers delousing children, tenderness disguised as routine. In Chinese scrolls of domestic life, servants attend to their master's hair with combs finer than any brush, a sign of care as much as hygiene. These images carried no shame. They treated lice picking as part of household rhythm, as ordinary as pouring tea. Moralists, however, used vermin to preach. Fleas and lice symbolize sin, crawling unseen until exposed by confession. A confessor was a comb, a sermon the lie-water boiling filth from souls. Satirical broadsides described corrupt officials as lice on the body of the state, fattening on common blood. Political cartoonists in revolutionary France drew aristocrats as bloated vermin feeding on peasants, the metaphor literalized until readers itched. The humor was dark but necessary. When everyone itched, laughing made endurance easier. Soldiers in trenches joked about company mascots hopping in their shirts. Crusaders scribbled verses comparing lice to loyal companions who followed them even into battle. Mongol horsemen named fleas after rival tribes, scratching them as mock conquests. Shared misery turned into shared language, and that language softened despair. Did the jokes make the infestation lighter? Perhaps not physically, but psychologically. To call lice pearls was to turn humiliation into pride. To laugh at a flea in poetry was to reclaim control. Even disgust, when voiced in rhyme or picture, became bearable. People wove vermin into their culture not because they admired them, but because silence was worse. And so the image of wigs full of lice, though exaggerated, persisted in satire long after barbers perfected boiling and powders. The exaggeration carried cultural truth, that even the wealthiest could not escape what the poorest knew daily. A king might wear velvet, a merchant might buy ambergris, a poet might lace words with wit, but all of them scratched. Fleas and lice were democracy with teeth. He scratches, and the barber answers. For centuries, barbers were not only cutters of hair, but guardians against vermin. Their shops smelled of soap, vinegar, and sweat, and inside them men lined up not just for trims, but for combing, shaving, fumigation. The barber's combs had teeth as fine as prayer beads, carved from bone or ivory, soaked in vinegar between clients. A customer sat while the barber's fingers hunted, plucking nits with the precision of surgery. Laughter from the doorway reminded everyone that dignity was always on loan when a grown man sat to be deloused. Payment was in coins for nobles, in barter for peasants, eggs, bread, ale. Bathhouses joined the fight. In Roman times they had been arenas of cleanliness, though vermin followed even there. Medieval Europe stews, Ottoman hammams, Russian banyas, Japanese sento, all served as communal arsenals against fleas and lice. Steam loosened hair, hot water drowned parasites, attendants wielded combs as weapons. In Russia, villagers whipped each other with birch branches until sweat streamed, then plunged into cold rivers, believing vermin drowned with the heat. In Istanbul, men soaked in marble chambers, their wigs left outside for fumigation with sulfur. In Japan, mothers sat with children in public baths, picking lice as naturally as washing ears. These spaces cost coin, an entry fee, a towel fee, sometimes more for oils or herbs. The poor bathed rarely. The wealthy turned baths into rituals of health. Still, for everyone, steam and water meant one night of itchless sleep. Armies institutionalized the war. In every campaign, lice marched with soldiers more faithfully than banners. Roman legions boiled tunics in campfires, smoke billowing over tents. Medieval crusaders held delousing hours when knights and squires stripped shirts in the sun, cracking lice by thumbnail, joking about whose blood they had stolen. By the Napoleonic Wars, delousing was routine. Soldiers stripped on command, their uniforms baked in ovens or boiled in vats. Steam barrels travelled with armies. The cost was time stolen from drill, but commanders knew vermin carried fever. A battalion scratching was a battalion weakened. Sailors fought their own battle. On ships, hammocks swarmed after weeks at sea. Crews dragged bedding onto decks, hung it in sunlight, and beat it with sticks until clouds of dust and vermin drifted away. Clothes were boiled in iron pots, vinegar wiped along seams, candles passed over wooden bunks. Admirals knew fleas and lice bred typhus. Deaths at sea were as often vermin-borne as battle-borne. The British Navy in the 18th century even issued sulfur fumigators for holds, choking both insects and men for the sake of survival. Professional fumigation appeared in cities. Pest houses offered sulfur chambers where wigs, cloaks, and bedding were smoked. Fees were steep, affordable only for households that could spare coin. Hospitals adopted them grudgingly, fighting infestation as much as disease. Tools evolved: brass combs heated in flames, scratchers with double ends, powders scented with musk to disguise bitter staves acre. Delousing became a business and disgust was monetized. Did these measures succeed? Partially. A barber's comb bought a week, a bathhouse a night, an army oven a campaign without fever. Nothing eradicated vermin. But these routines carved order from misery. Men returned to barracks cleaner, wigs returned from fumigation lighter, mothers left bathhouses with children's scalps momentarily clear. Relief, not cure, was the product. Costs were constant. A coin to the barber, a copper to the bath, a day's labour for the army oven, hours lost in gossip and scratching. The wealthy bought silver scratchers and perfumed powders. The poor relied on vinegar, smoke, and nails. But all paid. And the proof was visible. Fewer welts, quieter nights, fewer soldiers collapsing in fever. In a world without insecticides, these were victories. And so barbers sharpened their combs, bathhouses filled their cauldrons, armies built fumigators, ships aired hammocks, scratchers dangled from belts, powders clouded wigs, soldiers sat bare-chested in sunlight, crushing lice in comradely silence. These were not trivial acts, but survival. Vermin were not guests, they were adversaries. The fight was endless, but professionalism made it bearable. He scratches beneath the powdered mountain on his head, and the satire writes itself. The 18th century's love affair with wigs, perukes, periwigs, towers of hair powdered and perfumed, became a battlefield where fashion and parasites clashed. Later centuries would laugh. Those wigs were crawling with lice. The truth is more complicated, but the image stuck, because wigs embodied contradiction. They were meant to control vermin by shaving heads, yet they became symbols of infestation in gossip and caricature. The wig began as a solution. In the 17th century, syphilis left many balding, and lice thrived in natural hair. Shaving the scalp and covering it with a wig seemed sensible. Wigs could be boiled, fumigated, or dusted with insecticidal powders in ways that natural hair could not. Barbers advertised fumigation services. A wig baked in an oven or smoked with sulfur returned fresh to its owner. Soldiers and courtiers alike embraced them. Louis XIV turned the wig into a badge of nobility. His court followed, and soon Europe's elites were topped with cascades of curls. But maintenance was constant. Wigs required powder, flour or starch mixed with orris root or scented oils to whiten and perfume them. Powder clung to skin, mixed with pomatum, a grease of fat and fragrance, and formed a sticky base. To fleas, this was banquet. A wig left neglected did indeed crawl, but that was neglect, not inevitability. Wealthy nobles sent wigs weekly to barbers for delousing. Poor imitators powdered without cleaning, scratching constantly. Satirists exaggerated the latter, depicting entire colonies of vermin thriving in wigs. The caricatures were brutal. London prints showed dandies with fleas leaping from powdered towers. French pamphlets mocked courtiers who spent fortunes on scent while scratching discreetly with silver-handled scratchers. German poets joked that a noble's wig held more livestock than his fields. The myth of wig full of lice spread because it was funny and democratic. Parasites levelled hierarchies. King or peasant all itched, yet wigs had defenders. Barbers and physicians noted that lice preferred body seams, shirts and stockings, over powdered wigs. A shaved head reduced scalp lice, and wigs, when maintained, were easier to cleanse than natural hair. The myth persisted because satire stuck harder than hygiene. Ask a pamphleteer which made better copy, a wig as practical cleanliness or a wig as crawling nest. The answer was always the nest. Scratchers became accessories of fashion. Ladies carried ivory back scratchers, gentlemen silver scratch spoons, all designed to slip under lace and wigs. These objects were equal parts tool and joke, displayed with a smirk. To own one was to admit that fashion itched. Flea traps, too, became curiosities. Tiny jeweled boxes smeared with honey, worn as pendants, meant to lure fleas from powdered skin. Did they work? Rarely. Did they entertain? Always. Wigs multiplied in form. Short bob wigs for soldiers, grand fontange towers for women, queues tied with ribbon for bureaucrats. Each had its vulnerabilities. The taller the wig, the harder to clean. Barbers worked long hours, boiling curls, dusting powders of Staves Acre or pyrethrum to kill lice. Wealthy households paid retainers to maintain wig wardrobes. Poorer wearers reused wigs until seams frayed and infestation followed. Costs defined experience. A noble spent dozens of livres yearly on wig care, keeping vermin at bay. A clerk could afford one wig, rarely serviced, powdered at home, crawling soon enough. The myth of verminous wigs grew from the poor majority, exaggerated upward in satire until even kings were imagined scratching. The wealthy laughed nervously because they knew the joke could be true if they skipped their barber. Fleas, meanwhile, ignored wigs and tormented everyone. Powdered wigs attracted them no more than natural hair, but the sheer volume of fabric, lace and pomatum made scratching harder to disguise. Diaries complain of courtiers distracted mid-conversation, slipping scratchers under periwigs with practiced grace. The act became choreography. Guests pretended not to notice. Satirists noticed everything. The revolution turned wigs into symbols. In France, powdered towers mocked for harbouring vermin became emblems of decadence. Pamphlets portrayed aristocrats scratching while peasants starved. To accuse nobles of lice was to accuse them of rot, inside and out. Guillotines ended the itch, but the myth survived. Long after wigs fell from fashion, the image of crawling perukes remained lodged in memory, shorthand for an age of excess. Were wigs really full of lice? Sometimes. Maintained, they were cleaner than natural hair. Neglected, they became nests. The truth lies between ridicule and defense, but the myth had power because it carried cultural truth. No amount of perfume or powder could hide the universality of vermin. Scratchers of ivory could not erase the fact that kings and beggars alike itched. Thus, the 18th century's wig became not only a fashion, but a cultural insectarium, less in reality than in imagination. Pamphlets, caricatures, and gossip preserved the crawling image because it reminded everyone that beneath powder and lace, humanity shared the same enemies. Fleas and lice were democracy's earliest voters, marking every scalp without regard for title. He scratches less often now, not because vermin have vanished, but because the world has finally begun to push them back. The 19th century arrives with soap in wider use, boiling water more available, laundries industrializing, and germ theory whispering that disease has allies too small to see. Lice and fleas remain everywhere, in cottages, in barracks, in tenements, but their grip on imagination begins to weaken. The fight that had been private for millennia, carried out with combs and fingernails, slowly becomes public health. Cities start the change. Urban reforms sweep through Europe after waves of cholera, forcing governments to consider that filth breeds sickness. Piped water, sewage drains, public bathhouses, not luxuries, but necessities. Each advance does double duty. It removes the stench of waste and it starves vermin. With cleaner streets and less straw on floors, fleas lose hiding places. With laundries that boil and bleach, lice die faster. Soap, once a craft luxury of olive oil and lye, becomes a factory staple, scented, wrapped, affordable. Advertisements proclaim that cleanliness is not only virtuous but patriotic. To itch becomes embarrassing in ways it had never been before. Armies adapt quickly. Napoleon's campaigns still crawled with lice, but by the late 19th century, military manuals include delousing as regular duty. Steam sterilizers march with regiments, field laundries boil uniforms, and chemical powders, naphthalene, mercury bichloride, are sprinkled into seams. The Great War proves how stubborn vermin remain. Soldiers in trenches name their lice chats or greybacks, curse them, burn seams with candles, and laugh bitterly that lice are the only victors. Typhus sweeps armies in the east, killing more than bullets. The response is industrial, vast delousing stations where men strip, uniforms steamed, bodies dusted with chemicals. For the first time, control feels possible on a scale larger than a family. Ships too reform. The British Navy in the 18th century had relied on vinegar and sun. By the 20th, hammocks are laundered regularly, holds fumigated with sulfur dioxide, sailors inspected. Merchant ships carry insect powders alongside compasses. Colonies receive imported technologies. Kerosene sprayed on bedding, insecticidal soaps. It is imperfect but relentless. Fleas survive, but the margin shrinks. The home changes most of all. Bedrooms that once hid straw mattresses and clouds of fleas are stripped bare, filled with iron beds, wire springs, washable sheets. Wooden floors replace rushes. Carpets are beaten outside, washed in communal vats. Flea traps remain in parlours, but now they use sticky paper and kerosene, not honey in silver boxes. Scratches of ivory disappear into curiosity cabinets. Nitcombs persist, but they are accompanied by bottles of carbolic soap and later by kerosene rinses. The ritual of mother and child remains, but she can add disinfectant to her arsenal. Science adds names. Fleas become Siphonaptera, lice divided into head, body, pubic. Their life cycles are studied, their eggs described, their habitats mapped. Knowledge turns mystery into strategy. Entomologists publish manuals for soldiers and school teachers. Public posters warn, boil bedding weekly, comb hair daily, avoid straw ticks. The war against vermin becomes bureaucratic, with governments funding campaigns against typhus and plague. Chemistry provides weapons. In the late 19th century, kerosene is poured onto scalps, suffocating lice but burning skin. Mercury compounds are used in ointments, dangerous but effective. Sulfur ointments remain, cheap and smelly. The 20th century transforms the fight with DDT, first sprayed in barracks, then in refugee camps, then in schools. For the first time in history, infestations can be ended in weeks. Typhus epidemics collapse in delousing stations dusted with DDT during the Second World War. Soldiers cheer as white powder rains down, associating it with relief. Only later will the environmental cost become clear. Fleas too face industrial assault. Rat control campaigns in cities reduce hosts, cutting plague's chain. Insecticides sprayed on bedding and walls thin their ranks. Pets begin to receive collars and powders, making homes cleaner than any century before. By mid-20th century, in wealthier regions, flea bites shift from daily nuisance to occasional surprise. Lice remain in schools, but outbreaks are smaller, shorter, controlled by shampoos with pyrethrins. Mothers still comb, but with confidence of final victory, not endless stalemate. Culture changes with victory. Where scratching was once public and unashamed, now it becomes stigma. To be seen itching in a salon or classroom is to invite whispers. Advertisements promise not only cleanliness but social respectability. Soap makers and chemical companies trade on disgust, warning that vermin are marks of poverty and failure. Fleas and lice are driven not only from beds but from polite conversation. They survive, but they are banished to margins, refugee camps, prisons, overcrowded dormitories. For the first time in history, a middle-class family can expect years without a single bite. Memory, however, persists. Language carries it. English louse becomes an insult for the dishonest. Lousy means miserable. French soldiers keep chat as slang. Russian peasants still mutter proverbs about fleas jumping higher than dogs. Satirical images of wig wearers scratching survive in museums, as much caricature as history. Knit combs and silver scratchers end up in collections, relics of an intimacy with vermin that modern people prefer to forget. Yet they fascinate. Visitors marvel at jeweled flea traps, laugh at ivory scratchers, shudder at the thought of powdered wigs crawling. Modern medicine remembers differently. Fecal transplant resurrects disgust as therapy. Leech therapy returns in microsurgery. Air-night combs remain standard, proving that some tools never vanish. Anthropologists note how grooming persists as social bond. Parents still pick through children's hair, though now they search for dandruff instead of lice. Monkeys in zoos remind us of origins. We may kill vermin with chemicals, but the gesture of care endures. And still, infestations return where poverty rules. Refugee camps, slums, trenches, prisons, these echo older centuries. Typhus outbreaks flare when hygiene collapses. Schools still send notes home when head lice spread. The war is not won everywhere, but the difference is scale. We now have weapons powerful enough to end infestations quickly if society chooses to wield them. Thus, the history of lice and fleas ends not with eradication, but with management. From combs and smoke to chemistry and sanitation, the methods grew harsher and cleaner. Disgust shifted from tolerance to stigma. Tools shifted from fingers to sprays, and yet the story remains human. Scratching in doorways, gossip traded during nitpicking, soldiers laughing as they burned seams with candles, children squirming while mothers combed. Wigs and flea traps may be gone, but the memory clings like an itch. When later centuries ask, were wigs full of lice? Did nobles crawl? Did peasants ever rest? The answer remains the same. Everyone fought, no one escaped. Some laughed, some cursed. And every generation invented its own scratches, powders, and stories. What has changed is not the enemy, but our arsenal, and the conviction that disgust no longer rules our daily lives. The itch lingers only in memory, and even that memory is scratched into history with the teeth of a comb. Settle in for our next story, where we explore the history of jewels, from the ancient Aztecs to the cowboys. He learns early that a duel is not simply two men and two weapons, but a stage where a community decides what to believe about justice, courage, and rank. Long before pistols at dawn, single combat served law and religion as much as pride. In one world, it is a test in front of gods. In another, a shortcut for courts that lack evidence. In another, a vow for honor that threatens to explode if not bled carefully on a field. The details change. Obsidian blades or rapiers, stones set in temple courtyards or frosty meadows outside a city gate. But the grammar remains. Challenge, acceptance, witnesses, weapons agreed, terms sworn, and consequences if courage or conscience falters. He begins not in Europe, but in the highlands and basins where Mesoamerican cities rose. Among the Mexica, Aztecs, the most famous duel is not a gentleman's appointment, but a ritual called by the Spanish gladiatoria, gladiatorial sacrifice, performed on a round stone, the Temelacatl. A captured warrior is tethered by a long cord, given a shield and a weapon sometimes dulled or feather-edged, and set against a sequence of elite fighters armed with sharp obsidian macuahuitl. The captive fights bravely, praised for skill, beaten for spectacle, and, unless myth interferes, is worn down and taken to the knife. It is not a duel of equals. It is a religious drama, whose end is expected. Who fights? Captives from enemy cities chosen for renown, champions from noble houses eager for glory. With what? Heavy wooden swords edged with obsidian that can maim with a single sweep. For what? To feed gods, to enact the cosmic exchange that keeps the sun rising. If the captive refuses, he does not live to regret it. Ritual leaves no space for absence. Failure to present oneself is impossible. The temple precincts enforce attendance, and courage on the stone is the only decision left. Among the Maya, violence is more often collective, war to seize captives for sacrifice. But echoes of single combat flicker in inscriptions and art, nobles confronting each other with spears and shields, the spoils afterward, the capture and public humiliation of the loser. Ritual is again the spine. The fight proves status, and the end is parade and bloodletting before onlookers. If someone failed to appear for such a trial, the script did not pause. Honor and fate were entangled with kingship. Absence was treason to the calendar, and punishment followed as inexorably as the priest's flint. Far away and centuries earlier, Greek singers turned duels into literature. In Homer's world, champions step out from bronze-clad ranks to trade spears under the gaze of armies and gods. Achilles and Hector are not settling a quarrel, but making a story, compressing a war into a pair of bodies. Who fights? Elite men whose names will live if they die. With what? Long ash spears, short swords, shields big enough to be described as moving towers. For what? Glory, vengeance, the calming of mass slaughter, with a smaller agony that carries meaning. If a champion refuses, shame does its quiet work. The bards will not be kind. Medieval Europe returns the duel to law. When evidence is scarce and oaths conflict, kings and councils allow a wager of battle, judicial combat, in which God is asked to choose. In the Empire, it is a knight on horseback or a burgher with a club. In England, it is two freemen in a ring before the county court. In France, it can be even stranger. Husband and wife fighting under rules that hamstring the man and arm the woman with a stone wrapped in cloth, the better to make divine verdict obvious through odds. Who fights? Litigants too stubborn to accept the judge's skepticism. With what? Clubs, shields, swords, sometimes even agricultural tools if those define status. For what? Land, reputation, guilt or innocence when witnesses lie. What of the man who does not come? The court answers, default equals defeat. In the records of German towns, a no-show forfeits the case. In England, the defendant who refuses battle loses his claim. In some places, the coward is branded with infamy, unfit to swear oaths or sit in assemblies. Cowardice becomes a civil disability, and men who fear wounds fear exclusion more. He watches the duel mutate into chivalry. Tournaments celebrate controlled combat. Pas d'armes invite challengers to strike a shield hung at a crossroads. Single combats settle border insults when kings are weary of paying armies to trade arrows. Here the duel is half law and half theatre, patronized by princes. Who fights? Knights in mail and plate, men bred for horses and heraldry. With what? Lances for the first crash, swords and maces for the messy closeness after. For what? Fame, ransom, the settling of spats whose stakes are nominal, but whose outcome shapes reputations. Fail to appear, and heralds record the insult. A shield left hanging, a name spoken with scorn in lists, a tale told at courts that spreads like wine stains on linen. Shame is geography. It crosses borders faster than an army. By the late Middle Ages, urban Europe reinvents the duel again, no longer as ordeal or knightly sport, but as private arbitration of honor. Italian city-states develop a culture of cartelli, formal challenges posted or delivered, over slights spoken in squares or seductions whispered under balconies. Who fights? Gentlemen, soldiers, humanists with too much Latin and too little patience, even artisans jealous of face and gild. With what? Swords. First the long side sword, later the slimmer rapier, occasionally daggers as second weapons. Armor vanishes, skill replaces weight. For what? Honor defined as reputation among peers, a currency that purchases patronage and marriage as surely as coin does. If he refuses to appear. Seconds, the arbiters appointed by each side, agree to post him, his name nailed to tavern doors, the story told that he failed courage, sometimes a glove hung in a public place as a sneer. In some codes, the non-attender earns a box on the ear delivered by the challenger before witnesses, punishment more poisonous than a wound. Codes begin to sprout. The German Fechtbücher teach technique. Italian masters write treatises that treat swordplay like geometry. Custom congeals around fairness. Equal weapons, equal ground, equal sun. In France and Spain, the monarchy oscillates between bans and indulgence, executing duelists to discourage the rest, but always too late to erase the last fight from a poet's stanza. The duel becomes a contagion of example. Each death provokes more challenges. Each apology accepted writes a precedent. He notes that at the low end of society, duels never fully belong. Peasants fight brawls, apprentices scrap in alleys. Disputes end with bruises and fines, not formal stations at dawn. Honor here is communal, policed by neighbors and guilds rather than by steel. Yet single combat leaks downward. Butchers have knives and tempers. Shepherds have staffs and slopes to disappear on. Courts see their own version of the challenge, two men agreeing to meet with cudgels outside city gates. And judges, when they hear of it, punish both for making law their private sport. Absence here earns not printed shame, but mockery sung in workshops, ostracism that stings like nettles. He circles back to the Americas before pistols, where ritual single combat exists beside war. Among Andean peoples, tinku, ritual fights between communities, spill blood to ensure fertility. Champions step forward and swing slings and fists while elders watch. The purpose is not to kill, but to exchange pain for rain. Who fights? Young men hungry for status. With what? Stones in woven slings, stick clubs. For what? The earth's favor and communal cohesion. Fail to appear, and the village not only loses face, it risks cosmological imbalance. Absence is betrayal of field as much as a friend, punished by ridicule, fines, sometimes beatings by elders who see dereliction as a crack in the wall that keeps hunger out. For all their differences, the early chapters of dueling teach the same lesson he will see repeated with pistols in glades and sabres on riverbanks. The duel is the community's mirror. It shows who counts as a person with honor to defend, captive or champion, noble or freeman, litigant or scholar, and what objects are sacred enough to kill for. Gods who demand blood, courts that demand verdicts, reputations that demand proof. It also shows how absence is punished, in temples by compulsion, in courts by forfeiture, in chivalry by herald's ink, in towns by posting and caning, in villages by the elders' collective hand. To decline a duel is to refuse not just a fight, but an identity offered by peers. The next chapters will trade obsidian for steel, and later steel for powder, but the summons will sound the same. Choose courage on our terms, or wear the brand of a man who would not come. He sees Europe slip into its renaissance, and with it dueling becomes less ordeal of law and more theatre of pride. The rapier gleams in Italian cities, not only as a weapon, but as a badge of culture. By the 16th century, every insult, a word at a banquet, a glance too long at a woman, a dispute over a debt, might end with an appointment under the morning sky. The duel is no longer about divine judgment, as in medieval trial by combat, nor about ritual sacrifice, as in Aztec temples. It is about reputation, and reputation is worth bleeding for. In Florence and Venice, men of letters carried swords as naturally as poets carried verses. Masters like Achille Marozzo and Salvator Fabris wrote treatises thick with diagrams, turning swordplay into geometry. The duel was their classroom and their advertisement. In Spain, the Destreza school of fencing developed, proud of its circular footwork and philosophical flavour. Men quoted Aristotle while pointing blades at one another. In France, the rapier slid through courts, making every nobleman half scholar, half predator. To be unskilled with the sword was to admit unfitness for society itself. The reasons for duels multiplied. A nobleman accused of cowardice challenged the accuser to defend the claim with steel. A young courtier jostled another in a dance, and the offended party demanded satisfaction. Lovers quarrelled over favours, poets quarrelled over verses, officers quarrelled over pay. The duel became a universal solvent for friction among elites. Who fought? Gentlemen, mostly, but also students, soldiers, even lawyers. What with? Rapiers, later small swords, sometimes accompanied by daggers in the offhand. What for? To prove worth in front of a watching world. Kings tried to stem the tide. Henry IV of France lost so many nobles to duelling that he issued decrees punishing participants with death. Yet challenges multiplied, sometimes in defiance, sometimes with royal wink. In Paris alone, historians count thousands of duel deaths in the 16th and 17th centuries. To duel was to gamble not only with life but with property. The king claimed estates of duelists executed after surviving their fights. Still, the lure of honor outweighed the risk of ruin. The ritual hardened into form. A man insulted sent a written challenge. The cartel delivered by a second. Seconds were not only messengers, but arbiters. They inspected weapons, measured the field, and sometimes attempted reconciliation. If reconciliation failed, they watched for fairness. Witnesses gathered, often friends, sometimes curious strangers. The men saluted, took positions, and fought until first blood, incapacitation, or death, depending on the agreed code. The duel was choreographed violence, deadly ballet. What happened if one refused to appear? Here the punishment was not legal, but social, and social punishment bit deeper. To be posted as a coward meant exclusion from salons, loss of patronage, whispers in every tavern. A glove nailed to a public door announced shame. In some places, the challenger had the right to strike the absent man in public, to box his ears before witnesses, condemning him more thoroughly than any sword could. Cowardice followed a man's family, staining brothers and sons. It was often said that death in a duel was preferable to living branded as one who would not fight. Outside Europe, echoes appeared in colonies. Spanish officers in the New World duelled with rapiers beneath the gaze of churches, claiming to bring civility even as blood soaked into the plazas. In Mexico, dueling mixed with indigenous ritual combat. In the Philippines, duels between Spanish and local elites blended European codes with native blades. The practice travelled easily because honor was a universal language and steel spoke it fluently. Russia, by the 17th century, absorbed dueling from the West. Under Peter the Great, who imported European fashions with fury, officers settled quarrels with sabres or pistols. Codes circulated, often borrowed from French manuals. Yet Russian duels carried their own severity. Refusing to appear was met not only with shame, but with official punishment. Removal from posts, exile, even flogging in earlier times. Among nobles, dueling became a badge of belonging to the modern elite. Among commoners, it remained illegal brawling. The Enlightenment tried to mock the duel into extinction. Philosophers wrote essays ridiculing the absurdity of killing over words. Courts punished survivors more consistently. Yet the duel survived because it was not about logic, but about theatre. The duel dramatized what men wanted to believe about themselves, that they were masters of their fate, willing to risk all for dignity. Reason could not kill what vanity fed. By the 18th century, pistols began to replace swords. the flintlock's rise coincided with fashion's turn towards smaller, lighter blades more suited for ceremony than killing. Pistols introduced new uncertainties, misfires, uneven barrels, powder dampened by dew. The duel became more lethal and more unpredictable. Men continued anyway. They met in Parisian gardens, in English meadows, in Russian birch groves. The logic remained the same: appear or be branded, fire or lose face. Even clergy duelled. Bishops and abbots, though forbidden, were caught exchanging challenges. Students duelled at universities over insults scribbled on lecture notes. Officers duelled on campaign, ignoring that the enemy was a more pressing danger. Across Europe, the ritual refused to fade. He notes how dueling manuals shifted. Where earlier they stressed technique, later they stressed codes, how to issue a challenge, how to accept, how to fire, how to bow to one's foe. The duel became less about skill and more about honor as symbol. Even missing deliberately, a practice called de-liping, became codified, a way to prove willingness to risk without intent to kill. But this too could backfire. Some considered it noble, others cowardly. Failure to appear at a duel in this era carried the heaviest shame yet. In London, gentlemen who shirked challenges were lampooned in newspapers. In Paris, they were excluded from court. In Russia, the Tsar himself might hear of a coward's name. The absent man might find his career over, his family mocked, his children avoided. He lived, but he did not live well. And so, from Italy's fencing halls to France's gardens, from Spain's plazas to Russia's birch groves, the duel thrived. It was part law, part theatre, part madness. It was condemned from pulpits and benches, yet celebrated in salons and songs. Men bled for pride, and those who refused to bleed suffered worse wounds of the tongue. The Renaissance and Enlightenment duels prepared the stage for their descendants. Pistols among English gentlemen, sabres among Russian officers, revolvers among cowboys, even challenges whispered on the American frontier. The weapons changed, the landscape shifted, but the grammar held: insult, challenge, seconds, witnesses, risk, shame. To duel was to declare oneself a man among men, and to refuse was to accept exile from that community. He watches the duel cross the Atlantic, but when it steps onto the dust of the American frontier, it changes its clothes. Gone are the ruffled sleeves, the wigs, the polite bows in gardens. In their place are boots caked with mud, revolvers worn low on the hip, and insults shouted across saloons whose floors crunch with sawdust. Here the duel is not so much ceremony as collision, but the grammar remains recognizable. Challenge, witnesses, weapons, and consequences for those who refuse. The cowboy and the gambler are the duel's new actors. They are not nobles, but they carry reputations every bit as fragile. A man's word in a cattle town is often all he has, and an insult, cheat, coward, liar, sticks to him like burrs until scraped off with blood. A quarrel at a poker table can escalate into a challenge, sometimes formal, sometimes as quick as step outside. The dusty street becomes the dueling ground, the horizon a silent jury. Who fights? Ranch hands, gamblers, lawmen, outlaws, any man whose pride feels cornered. With what? Revolvers, rifles, sometimes knives. For what? Honor measured in fearlessness, reputation in a town where everyone knows everyone else's business. The weapons themselves alter the ritual. In Europe, pistols were matched pairs, carefully weighed and presented by seconds. On the frontier, revolvers were personal tools, carried daily. There was rarely a matched set. Each man used his own. Accuracy varied wildly. Misfires, jams, and even drunken fumbling turned duels into chaos. Yet the myth of the showdown at high noon took root. Men squared their shoulders, stared each other down, and waited for the twitch of a hand. Sometimes seconds counted aloud. Sometimes bystanders simply held their breath. In truth, many frontier duels were not the lightning-fast quick draws of Hollywood. They were close-range confrontations, men stepping into the street, revolvers raised almost simultaneously, firing until one fell. Accuracy mattered less than courage. Hesitation killed more than poor aim. Witnesses swore afterward who drew first, who fired true, who flinched. And as in Europe, the man who failed to appear bore wounds worse than bullets. What happened to those who refused? Town gossip was lethal. A man who did not show up when challenged was branded a coward, his word worthless. In cattle towns, that could end contracts. In saloons, that could end credit. Cowardice cost livelihood as well as respect. Some communities went further. Vigilantes might brand the absent man publicly, whispering until he left town. The frontier offered no protection for those who would not defend themselves. To live without honor was to live as an outcast. The duel's form varied. In some places, especially in the South and along the Mississippi, European codes lingered. The Code Duello of Ireland was carried to America and adapted in Louisiana and Texas. Gentlemen challenged each other formally, seconds arranged pistols, and fights were carried out in groves at dawn. Andrew Jackson himself fought duels before becoming president, one of which left him with a bullet lodged in his chest for life. These were the polished cousins of frontier shootouts, still wrapped in ritual. Further west, ritual frayed. The duel became more spontaneous, often alcohol-fueled. A gambler accused of cheating might be forced outside at once. A cowboy insulted in a dance hall might draw then and there. Some fights were even arranged spectacles, with townsfolk gathering to watch, bets laid on outcomes. The duel transformed into entertainment. Death was not always the result. Sometimes both men fired wildly, missing everything but pride. But blood, even a scratch, sufficed to prove courage. Laws struggled to contain the practice. Sheriffs tried to ban duels, judges fined survivors, but enforcement was thin. Communities tolerated the practice because they saw it as a release valve. Better two men kill each other in the street than a feud spill into a wider brawl. Newspapers reported duels with relish, feeding myths even as they condemned them. A notorious affray in one town became cautionary tale in another, but everywhere it added to the legend. Cowboys themselves carried ambivalence. They mocked those who sought duels too eagerly, calling them hotheads or fire eaters. A man who fought every week was not brave but reckless. Yet they also despised those who shrank from the challenge. Balance mattered, to be willing to face danger when needed, but not to seek it without cause. This balance mirrored European codes of honor, stripped of ceremony but not of weight. Sometimes duels spilled into absurdity. Accounts survive of men firing revolvers across pool tables, shooting holes in hats as warning shots, even settling disputes by knife fights in corrals, while horses looked on nervously. The duel was elastic, adapting to setting and temperament. What remained fixed was the consequence of absence. Refuse to meet, and your place in the community eroded. Appear and lose, and at least you were respected. Women, too, figured in the dueling landscape, though less often as combatants than as causes. Insults about fidelity, accusations of impropriety, and jealous quarrels sparked many shootouts. A man defending his wife's honor was praised. One who failed was mocked. Yet there are scattered tales of women taking part. Frontier women who picked up pistols against rivals, saloon keepers who defended reputations with knives. Their fights rarely gained the status of formal duels, but they echoed the same logic. Reputation defended through risk. Costs varied. A fine revolver was beyond many ranch hands' means, but any pistol sufficed. Ammunition was cheap, but the risk was dear. Doctors charged heavily to remove bullets. Graves cost labor to dig. Yet the real cost was reputation. Survive a duel, and you might earn years of respect. Refuse, and you lost it all in a single morning. By the late 19th century, law began to strangle dueling. States outlawed it, judges enforced bans more strictly, sheriffs cracked down. Yet even as duels waned, the myth grew. The image of two men squaring off in dusty streets became folklore, then cinema, then global archetype. What was once drunken violence transformed into legend, the showdown, the high noon, the test of courage distilled into a single gunshot. And so the cowboy inherited the duel from European nobles and Aztec warriors alike. The weapons changed, the rules loosened, but the stakes remained identical. A man's honor measured not by survival, but by his willingness to appear. Those who stayed home carried wounds no doctor could heal. He turns east and sees Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries, where the duel was both a borrowed custom and a national obsession. Imported from Western Europe, along with wigs, uniforms, and French phrases, it became one of the most vivid rituals of the Russian nobility. To understand Russian dueling is to understand a society that lived by honor as if it were coin, and treated insult as if it were a mortal wound. It began with Peter the Great, who forced Western fashions on boyars and officers alike. Along with frock coats and tobacco came the notion that a gentleman must defend his reputation not only in court, but in combat. By Catherine the Great's reign, dueling had become embedded in aristocratic culture. French tutors taught fencing, young nobles read the Code Duello alongside Molière. The duel became both pastime and punishment, a way to prove modernity while indulging ancient tempers. Who fought? Officers in the army, bureaucrats in civil service, poets in salons. Pushkin and Lermontov, two of Russia's greatest writers, both died in duels, proving that talent was no shield. Young men challenged over sleights in card games, whispers about mistresses, or poems construed as mockery. The Russian duel could erupt over matters trivial or grand, but each was presented as defense of honor. What with? Early on, swords and sabers, but by the 19th century, pistols dominated. Pairs of flintlocks, or later percussion pistols, were carried in velvet-lined cases, polished as symbols of status. Some families passed dueling pistols down as heirlooms, each scratch a record of pride defended. Unlike on the American frontier, weapons were matched, chosen by seconds to ensure fairness. Distance was measured carefully, shots counted, rules observed, at least in theory. The codes multiplied. Russian officers circulated hand-copied manuals outlining procedure, how to issue a challenge, how to appoint seconds, how to measure paces, when to allow reconciliation. These codes were half serious, half flexible, adjusted to circumstances. Sometimes a duel ended with first blood, sometimes with a single exchange of fire, sometimes with multiple volleys until one man fell. The object was not always death. Sometimes it was proof of courage. Yet death came often, as Pushkin's widow and Lermontov's comrades could attest. Punishments from the state were severe in law, mild in practice. Official decrees banned dueling. Survivors risked dismissal from service, loss of rank, exile to remote garrisons. In reality, courts-martial often winked. When high officers fought, superiors smoothed the matter. Tsars thundered against the practice, yet many nobles considered it inevitable. Honor ranked above legality, and emperors knew they could not legislate pride away. What of the man who did not appear? Here Russian culture sharpened shame into a weapon. Absence was recorded, whispered, sung in songs. A cowardly officer found his regiment cold, his superiors skeptical, his career ruined. At balls and salons, ladies turned their shoulders. At taverns, men laughed behind hands. To refuse a duel was to refuse belonging to the nobility itself. Better a grave than such exile. Famous cases underline the tension. In 1837, Alexander Pushkin, enraged by rumors of his wife's infidelity, challenged Georges Dantes. The duel was arranged formally, pistols at 10 paces. Pushkin fell mortally wounded, and Russia lost its greatest poet. A decade later, Mikhail Lermontov died in similar fashion, killed by a fellow officer. Both cases provoked waves of grief and condemnation, but also resignation. Dueling was blamed and excused in the same breath. The state punished D'Antes with exile. Lermontov's killer was tried and quietly forgiven. The pattern repeated: outrage, mourning, and continuation. Costs varied: pistols, seconds, doctors, all required money and connections. Duels were therefore aristocratic indulgences, symbols of class as much as courage. Peasants and merchants fought brawls, nobles fought duels. The gulf was clear, and it was maintained deliberately. To duel was to prove one belonged to Europe's civilized elite, even if one died for a trivial insult. The Russian duel carried peculiar intensity. Perhaps it was the vastness of the land, where isolation sharpened pride. Perhaps it was the weight of bureaucracy, which left personal honor as the only currency a man could truly control. Perhaps it was literature itself, where characters like Onegin and Pechorin taught generations that duels were destiny. Whatever the cause, dueling in Russia was bloodier, more fatal than in much of Europe. Those who refused faced consequences as brutal as bullets. They were written out of society, remembered not for their caution, but for their cowardice. In a world where even poets chose pistols, the absent man was invisible forever. And so, through salons and barracks, from Petersburg ballrooms to Caucasian outposts, Russia rehearsed the same ritual. A word became an insult became a challenge became a meeting at dawn. Seconds measured paces, pistols cracked, one man fell. The survivor risked exile, but exile was lighter than shame. And those who stayed home, who avoided the field entirely, carried wounds no doctor could heal. Disgrace carved into memory, whispered in every ballroom, printed in every glance. He notices how the duel begins to stumble in the 19th century, its old glamour tarnished by law, reform, and changing notions of honor. Where once kings winked and poets bled, now judges sharpen pens, newspapers sneer, and reformers call the practice barbaric. Yet even as governments outlawed dueling, men still meet in groves, gardens, and fields, unwilling to let centuries of ritual die quietly. The duel's decline is slow, dramatic, and punctuated by blood that seems all the more senseless as the modern world intrudes. In France, the revolution should have killed the duel. It promised equality under law, not verdicts by pistols. But the opposite occurred. Insults flew freely in a turbulent society, and officers of the Republic fought challenges almost as often as nobles of the Ancien Regime had. Napoleon himself despised wasteful dueling among his officers, yet tolerated it, preferring men obsessed with honor to men who sulked in barracks. By the mid-19th century, French codes of dueling were published openly, read like etiquette manuals. Duels over politics became commonplace, journalists and deputies firing at each other over columns and speeches. Some ended in scratches, others in corpses, all in headlines. Britain moved differently. The 18th century had seen a rash of duels among politicians, but public opinion soured. The fatal duel of Prime Minister William Pitt's ally in 1809 and the scandal of the Duke of Wellington fighting a political opponent in 1829 shocked the public. By the mid-19th century, English courts punished duelists with increasing severity, and the practice dwindled. The last famous British political duel, fought in 1852, ended with ridicule rather than admiration. Absence from a duel in England, once ruinous, now sometimes earned applause. Proof of common sense in a society moving toward Victorian respectability. In America, however, dueling held on longer, especially in the South. The Code Duello, imported from Ireland, was adapted into the rituals of Louisiana, Georgia, and Mississippi. Men of property defended honor with pistols under oak trees at dawn. The most infamous case remains Andrew Jackson, who fought multiple duels and carried bullets in his body for decades. In 1804, the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States, crystallized the practice's contradictions. Hamilton fired wide, perhaps deliberately, and Burr's shot killed him. The nation recoiled, and dueling's reputation never recovered in the North. By the Civil War, duels were rare, replaced by brawls or lawsuits. In the South, however, the ritual persisted into the late 19th century, with planters and politicians still settling quarrels in fields while newspapers scolded. Russia's story is bloodier. Pushkin and Lermontov died in the 1830s and 1840s, and their deaths horrified educated society. Tsars banned dueling repeatedly, officers' duels were punished with exile or dismissal, yet challenges continued. The refusal to appear was still treated as cowardice. Absence could kill a career as surely as a bullet. Yet by the late 19th century, the practice slowed. Courts-martial punished survivors more consistently, and newspapers printed mocking caricatures of duelists as out-of-date relics. Elsewhere in Europe, the decline followed similar lines. Germany codified dueling among students in ritualized mensur fencing bouts. Scars on cheeks became badges of courage, but fatalities diminished. Italy and Spain saw sporadic pistol duels into the early 20th century, often among politicians. In France, journalists still squared off as late as the 1960s, though with minimal intent to kill, firing wide or stopping at first blood. These were pantomimes of older duels, more theatre than mortal test. What happened to those who refused as dueling declined? The answer shifted with the age. In the 17th century, absence meant shame and exile. By the late 19th century, absence could mean prudence, even popularity. When a young officer refused to duel in the 1890s Germany, the press praised him as modern, rational. In Victorian England, a politician who declined was seen as sensible. Yet in Russia, Spain, and the American South, absence still stung. Culture lagged behind law. To refuse was less fatal than before, but in certain circles, cowardice still clung like smoke. The last famous American duel occurred in 1859 between Senator David Broderick and Judge David Terry in California. Broderick fell, and newspapers denounced the event as barbaric, a relic of darker centuries. In France, the last duel between deputies took place in 1967, with swords, ending in minor wounds and laughter. In Germany, student fencing scars lingered as romantic symbols well into the 20th century. Each case marked the duel's transition from deadly necessity to quaint curiosity. Costs changed too. Where once pistols and seconds were luxuries, by the 19th century, duels were as accessible as newspapers. Middle-class men duelled as readily as nobles, especially in France. Yet as laws tightened, the risk of prison outweighed the cost of shame. Better to endure whispers than to stand before a judge. The duel's decline was not sudden. It was worn away by bureaucracy, ridicule, and the slow erosion of belief in honor as fate. Still, the duel's memory survived in culture. Novels by Dumas and Tolstoy dramatized them. Operas staged them. Paintings romanticized them. Cinema later made them mythic. The French Garden Duel, the Russian Birch Grove, the American Frontier Showdown. Even as the practice vanished, its shadow lengthened. And so by the 20th century, the duel was no longer a daily possibility, but a nostalgic story. To refuse a duel no longer ruined a man. It often saved him. Yet the echo of centuries remained, the idea that to be insulted without reply was a wound deeper than flesh. The duel had died, but honor had not. He stands at the edge of modernity and realizes the duel has not vanished. It has only changed its costume. No longer do men meet at dawn with pistols or swords, but the idea of satisfaction, of honor defended and cowardice punished, lingers in language, in literature, in film. The duel has become less a practice than a myth, a ritual remembered rather than enacted, but myths have their own kind of immortality. In literature, duels are everywhere. Pushkin's Eugene Onegin crystallizes the Russian imagination, a quarrel between friends, seconds whispering in the frost, a pistol shot, a corpse in the snow. Dumas fills pages with musketeers flashing blades in alleys, where honor is defended between witty lines. Tolstoy paints the fatal formality of officers in war and peace. In each case, the duel is both plot and symbol, a way to dramatize choice, pride, and mortality. Readers absorb the lesson that a duel is not only a fight, but a crucible for character. Opera transforms dueling into aria. Verdi's La Traviata, Bizet's Carmen, countless librettos end with steel or pistols as accompaniment to song. On stage, the duel is not about legality, but spectacle. Audiences crave the fatal resolution of insult through melody and blood. Paintings follow, French canvases of rapiers flashing in sun-dappled gardens, English prints of pistols raised at dawn. In art, the duel is always beautiful, even when it is deadly. Cinema inherits the myth. In American westerns, the high noon showdown becomes the archetype. Two men face each other in dusty streets, hands hovering over holsters, entire towns holding their breath. It matters less who fires first than who stands his ground. Samurai films echo the same moment, blades unsheathed in silence, eyes locked. In Russian and European cinema, pistols in snow still crack, a homage to Pushkin and his heirs. The duel becomes shorthand for courage, for fatalism, for the human need to risk everything for reputation. Even language keeps the memory. To cross swords, to face off, to stand your ground, all duel-born phrases. To call someone yellow in the American West, or truss, coward in Russian salons, recalls centuries when refusal to fight was worse than death. Political cartoons still portray rivals at 20 paces, pistols raised as if argument must always resolve in combat. The duel lives as metaphor long after the field is empty. The rules, too, survive in softer forms. Sports carry echoes, boxing rings, fencing pistes, even chessboards are framed as honourable contests between two individuals, governed by codes, watched by referees who play the role once filled by seconds. When a player forfeits, shame still clings, a faint reminder of the stigma once attached to failing to appear. Why did the duel linger so powerfully in imagination? Because it dramatized a universal tension, the conflict between pride and survival, between belonging and individuality. Every society that practiced dueling tied it to honor, and every man who refused was punished, not with law, but with exile from community. That idea, that courage defines belonging, outlived the pistols. It still surfaces in phrases, in films, in quiet social codes where reputation is guarded as jealously as land. The punishment for refusal also remains in shadow. No one today is branded a coward for skipping a duel, but echoes linger. To lose face, to chicken out, to be called a coward in schoolyards or boardrooms, these are linguistic fossils of centuries when absence from a duel was ruin. The myth ensures that even when no shots are fired, reputation is still a duel fought daily in words, gestures, and memory. Globally, the duel's legacy is uneven. In Latin America, political duels survived into the 20th century, remembered in family histories. In France, journalists fought with swords as late as the 1960s, though blood rarely flowed. In Japan, the samurai duel became myth through literature, no longer practiced, but endlessly retold. In America, Hollywood froze the image of the cowboy showdown, exporting it until children worldwide imagined duels in dusty streets. Each culture preserved what it wanted: ritual, romance, or ridicule. Museums now display dueling pistols, gilded cases with velvet interiors. Visitors stare, shiver, and smile, imagining dawnfields and whispered insults. The weapons are quiet, but the aura remains. Antique dealers sell dueling codes printed in elegant script. Collectors trade portraits of men who died at 25 for an ill-phrased joke. Even in death, duelists win attention. The duel, then, is not dead. It has migrated into memory, into art, into the very idea of what it means to be brave or foolish. Its rituals remind us how seriously humans take words, how willing we are to risk flesh for meaning. Its punishments remind us how communities police belonging. Its myths remind us that sometimes the story of a fight lasts longer than the fight itself. And so, from Aztec temples to European gardens, from Russian birch groves to American saloons, the duel survives. Not in law, not in daily life, but in imagination. A man challenged today will not meet with pistols at dawn, but he will still feel the weight of honor and the sting of shame. The duel is history, but the itch it scratched, the hunger for dignity, remains timeless.